Hi, I'm Lauren and I work for Meijer. People always ask, why do I shop there? It's because I can get great quality and value in one stop. Like this week's hottest deals on locally grown asparagus and select cuts of pork. Plus, I can earn 50 points per gallon of gas pumped at any Meijer Express through June 1st with M-Perks. Meijer has all I need in just one stop, and the same low Meijer prices in-store and online. Exclusions apply. See all deals in the Meijer app.
Welcome to the #1 podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not in the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city, so I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
Just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're gonna lose. Coming down the stretch, you're gonna lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod, here to have a fun discussion on MSU teams of the past. Specifically, we're going to look at our friend LSJ columnist Graham Couch's article from a few weeks ago. We ranked Izzo's 10 best teams that never won at all. So we're going to give our interpretation of that. Special thanks to Patrick Levy, who sent the idea in via email. If you have an idea for a show or comment or question, feel free to shoot them over to me at eric@tffinots.com. Final reminder that in the next week or so, I'm going to send out details of the supporting listener dinner to all of you who support the show on Patreon or Substack. I will be there along with hopefully a few guests and some swag. It should be a fun evening in East Lansing. Just kind of get together, talk some basketball, enjoy East Lansing for a little bit and some pizza. If you've been sitting on the fence supporting the show, you can head on over to our support page at tffinots.com/support to find the necessary links. Okay, I found this article fun. It's kind of reliving some history and I guess in some ways some frustration of teams that you thought, boy, could have really pulled it off. We're going to go through your list, Rod, and then we'll go back and compare it to where Graham ranked it. And so we'll start at 10 and just kind of work our way up to 1, if that sounds good to you.
Okay.
All right, cool.
Well, so my 10th best team, and I'll preface this by saying I went slightly afield from Graham's list in that I didn't restrict it to just Izzo teams.
Right.
But rather teams that I saw. So the Johnny Green team that got to the Final Four in the late 50s, I didn't see that team. So I can't, they probably, given that they were a Final Four team, they would have been in contention for a list like this, but I didn't see them.
Yeah.
So I've got one non-Izzo team on this list. And you could have made arguments for, I think, at least a couple of others, but in fact, maybe I should start before going in the list by talking about teams that would have just
the honorable
missed.
mentions.
Briefly. Yeah, the honorable mentions. I would start with the Izzo era, the 17-18 team, which got beat in the second round by Syracuse.
Right.
After having won the Big Ten, or a big share of Big Ten regular season title. That was an outstanding team by pretty much any measure. It was a good offensive team. It was a very good defensive team. It had a ton of talent. You had long-term NBA players on that roster, and actually 3 of them, in Miles Bridges, Jaren Jackson, and Xavier Tillman. And that's not counting Cassius Winston, who rates above all those guys in terms of their overall impact while at Michigan State. And then add in guys like Nick Ward, Josh Langford, Matt McQuaid, Kenny Goins, on and on and on. It was a Tum Tum Nairn. It was a very deep, very talented team that heading into the season, I think everybody felt had as good a chance as anyone to win the title. I certainly did. I went. It was actually the one live version of this podcast that we've done. I believe the only one to date, where we were both with my original partner, Sam. We went to the Champions Classic game against Duke, which MSU played reasonably well in, but lost early in the season in a 1-versus-2 matchup. And I think even coming out of that game, we both felt like, yeah, this is still a team that's capable of winning it all. If you remember, that was a year with all the ESPN-driven turmoil. And it when you look back at it, you look at how much Izzo went through, you look at how, remember Miles Bridges got ensnared in a controversy late in that season as well. It's amazing that they were able to actually pull off a share of a Big Ten championship, given everything that was swirling around. Now, the loss to Syracuse is one that still gets brought up by people.
Ben Carter.
I have a different take on it than many who like to just focus solely on that. My take is Michigan State missed a lot of open shots that they normally hit. And that's why they lost. Ben Carter playing or not playing wasn't really that big a factor. But in any event, it's still a very, very good team. I would also mention, and I'm trying to think about the Izzo teams that I didn't have on this list. Certainly there were many teams that were good enough to go to Sweet 16s, even Elite 8s, that did not make this list. The 14-15 team that made a Final Four did not make this list. That's probably a team worth an honorable mention designation because of the way they closed their season. They struggled a lot early. People remember the loss to Texas Southern in the non-conference, but by the time they were down the stretch in the Big Ten regular season, they were playing very, very good basketball. And then the Big Ten tournament, they took the best team Wisconsin's ever had to the brink in the Big Ten tournament championship game. Should have beaten them, really. And then went into the NCAA tournament and beat teams that were heavily favored over them, like Virginia and Louisville, en route to a Final Four before they ran into Duke and officials who felt compelled to blow a whistle every time somebody wearing blue and white decided to drive the lane. But that was still, that team was very, very good, especially at the end of the season, did not make my list. And then I would throw in a couple of teams from the Judd Heathcote era. The 1985-86 team led by Scott Skiles got to a Sweet 16, lost that Sweet 16 game to number 1 seed Kansas in the infamous
they
clock
lost the shot
game,
operator.
where the clock just stopped running, thus giving Kansas plenty more time. It might have even been, 20, 30 seconds additional time, which they were able to use to win the game. But I will tell you that team, it's not the best team I've ever seen at Michigan State by any means, but probably I would say the most fun to watch. That was a team that had two guys that were 6'8", and then neither one of which was a real center, and then 6'6", 6'2", 6'1". Very small team. The only reserve that played a lot of minutes, like a significant role, was Carlton Valentine, who was maybe 6'5", 6'6". So it was a very small team in an era where most Big Ten teams were big. And they used their speed and their skill, particularly their ability to pass and shoot, to their advantage. That team shot 56% from the floor without a starter taller than 6'8". That is phenomenal. Yeah, that was without a three-point shot, but trust me, if they'd had a three-point shot, that team would have been even higher scoring than they were. But they were a phenomenal transition team. They shot the ball extremely well. Scott Skiles had the best individual season I've ever seen a Michigan State player had. He was relentless, and he just elevated that team around him in a way unlike any other player I've seen. at Michigan State. It was truly a really, really fun team to watch play basketball. And then the 1989-90 team, which did win a Big Ten championship, did get a number 1 seed in the tournament, also lost in the Sweet 16, also shrouded by controversy on a shot by Kenny Anderson. Was it after the buzzer, and was it truly a three-pointer or not? Georgia Tech should have lost that game. They didn't. Michigan State lost again, just like 4 years earlier, because of bad calls, or a bad call. And thus Michigan State was out. But that was a team that, to win the Big Ten in that era, when you look at some of the guys that were in that Big Ten, you had Michigan as defending national champions with most of their guys back from that team. Now they were without Glenn Rice, which was significant, but still had I believe still had Lloyd Vaught. They had Terry Mills, they had Bill Robinson, they had Sean Higgins. That was a loaded team. Illinois had lost some guys from the Flying Illini Final Four team of the year prior, but also had a lot of key guys back, like Kendall Gill and Stephen Bardo. Purdue was as good as they were every year in that era under Gene Cady. Indiana and Ohio State both had young teams that would a year later be at the top of the league. They were just routing into form that season, but believe me, for teams that were middle of the pack at best, they were loaded. You know, Calbert Chaney was playing on that Indiana team. Jim Jackson was on that Ohio State team, among other guys. Minnesota was an Elite Eight team that year, led by Willie Burton. By Willie Burton from Detroit Toporas. So the Big Ten was absolutely loaded. And for Michigan State, led by Steve Smith, to win the Big Ten that year, it tells you something about how good they were. So those were all honorable mention teams. They didn't make my list, so I'll start getting into my list. My number 10 team was the 2015-16 team. And it says something when you've got a team that bows out in the first round of the NCAA tournament on this list, and who didn't win the Big Ten regular season title either. But I don't think there would be a lot of people listening to this, at least I would hope so, who would argue against their inclusion. And in fact, some people might have them higher, and there would be decent arguments for that. That was, I would say, after the Skiles team I just mentioned, the 15-16 Michigan State team was probably the second most entertaining team offensively I've ever seen.
I agree.
At Michigan State. They were such a good shooting team, and they were such a good passing team on top of that. You know, like that 85-86 team, they were led by a senior who was just a man on a mission in Denzel Valentine. And he, like Skiles did, he did get some National Player of the Year mention, was a first-team All-American, just an unbelievable season. The only guys I would put in the same conversation with him in terms of their overall impact on games, scoring, rebounding, and assists, would be Steve Smith and Irvin Johnson. I mean, they're the only two guys you could really put in that same category with Denzel as a senior.
I would just say that team, it was almost the opposite of most Izzo teams. Most Izzo teams kind of rounded into form by the end of the season, and that team was humming right out of the gate. And then they sort of lost their steam at the end of the year, sort of in a way.
No, not at the end. I would disagree with that. You're right about them being unusual in that they were humming right out of the chute. And it's something that I'm keeping in the back of my mind for this coming season, because before that year was the last time Michigan State took an overseas trip. They're going to do it this August.
Has it been that long? 10 years?
It has.
Wow.
It has. There was one other, and I forget what year it was. There was one, I don't think it was a COVID year, but there was one other that was scheduled at some point, and then it was canceled. But it's been that long. And that team, I think, really used that as an impetus to have a quick start because they had those extra practices. They had those experiences playing together. Now, there are some pretty serious differences between the two. That group was filled with a lot of veterans. It was a very experienced team led by Denzel, but you had Bryn Forbes, you had Matt Costello, you had a lot of guys who were key players who were part of that group and had been around each other and played together for a while. So this year's team is a different story in many respects, but I'm hoping that they may get a similar kind of bump. You do see that frequently with teams that go on a foreign trip.
Well, you could almost point to Illinois this last year, right? They're a team that we seem kind of disjointed.
Yep.
You look at the stats,
Yeah.
you're like, I don't know, this team's going to be good. And it seemed to help them a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is, I'm not saying it guarantees anything.
Yeah, of course not.
But I do think it is something that can be a real positive for a team. So something to look forward to perhaps this year. But getting back to that 15-16 team, they did get off to they started with Denzel with just an unbelievable game in the Champions Classic against Kansas. And they just went from there. And then Denzel got hurt.
Yeah.
And he got hurt right at the end of the non-conference. And so that led to kind of a slow start. I remember there was a really rough loss to Iowa at Iowa early in Big Ten play. That was back in the era where Big Ten games didn't start until early January.
Mm-hmm.
So you were kicking off after this great non-conference. They got off to a slow start. And really, even after Denzel came back, because he wasn't out that long, but even after he came back, they still weren't really putting it all together. And there was a home game. People may remember this, a home game against Maryland. And Maryland was really loaded that season. There were a lot of expectations around that team. And Michigan State had been struggling a bit. They're playing them at the Breslin. They were wearing the lime green uniforms. I think it's the only time they've ever worn them. And they just took Maryland out. And that was the catalyst to Michigan State finding itself. I would argue by the end of the year, they were actually playing extremely well, to the point that I didn't think there was anybody better in the country.
Yeah, you're
than
right.
were.
Yep, they were.
They ended up finishing second because Indiana got a real boost from a weak schedule.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And ended up edging them out for the regular season title. But Michigan State rolled through the Big Ten tournament and won that. And so by the end of that, by that Sunday, MSU was a 2 seed, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And there had been some real thought that they might get a 1. And they didn't end up getting it. And then, of course, they fell flat on their face against Middle Tennessee. But I don't think any of that changes. One afternoon where the opponent just shot the lights out, because Michigan State was actually pretty good in that game.
I thought they were very good. It was very, very dissimilar from this. It was dissimilar from the Syracuse game where they just couldn't hit anything.
Absolutely.
I mean, they're both disappointing losses you
Yeah.
didn't expect, but they were totally different as far as how they worked. Because State never seemed rattled or anything. It was impressive what Middle Tennessee did.
Yeah, and there were some issues. Kenny Goins got hurt, and he might have been a good defensive answer for one of Middle Tennessee's players who was at the 4 and was just really, really giving Deontay Davis a hard time. It wasn't a good matchup, but in any event, I even taking that into account, I don't think you can objectively look at that team and say that they weren't extremely good.
Yeah.
They were. And that loss, while very disappointing, doesn't change the fact that I think they clearly belong on a list like this.
All right, well then move up to your number 9. So the 9th team, that best team that didn't quite win at all.
Yeah.
You have the 13-14 season.
Yeah.
Led by Keith
and
Appling.
this was a team, again, with a lot of talent. You had, and I got to think about
Keith
this.
Appling is the senior.
3,
Gary Harris.
4 NBA. I was counting.
Oh, right.
NBA
Oh,
players.
yeah.
5 guys who played in the NBA at one point or another. Keith Appling, who had some time with Orlando. B.J. Dawson, who played some with the Clippers. 6, because Matt Costello played in the NBA a little bit with the Spurs.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Denzel Valentine. And then the 2 headliners were Adrian Payne and Gary Harris.
Right.
And Gary Harris is still playing in the NBA. So when you're talking about 6 guys on a roster who played at some point in the NBA, that's a lot of talent. And I think, look, I don't agree with it, But if somebody had that team near the top of a list like this, I wouldn't necessarily say they've got no argument for it. It was a weird team because they never, in the regular season, it was very up and down.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of great moments, and then there were moments of real inconsistency with that group. But it was another team that I'd have to go back and look. I believe they won the Big Ten tournament that year as well, I think.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
Okay. So again, by the end, by Selection Sunday, you felt like this team has really found itself. And the overall talent level was obvious. Like, nobody questioned that.
Right. Then
they go into the NCAA tournament. Adrian Payne had early in that tournament, I'm forgetting who it was against. Maybe it was Delaware. He had a 40-point game early in that tournament. And he had really, by the end of the season, AP had evolved into really the peak version of what I think people had expected from him when he was recruited to MSU. He had just become an almost impossible 3 levels scorer to stop. And had become a very solid rebounder. He had solved his endurance issues that he had and just had become a monster. And then, as I say, there was all this talent around him. And then that team beats Virginia, who was a 1 seed that year. And I think that was the moment where you thought, okay, this is truly a team that is capable of winning the whole deal. And unfortunately, in the Elite Eight, they ran into UConn, who had been very middling throughout the regular season, but they had that backcourt of Shabazz Napier and Ryan Boatwright, who just caught fire and ended up caught fire to the extent that they got all the way to the national title game and won it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And beat Michigan State in the Garden in a very hotly contested game. Michigan State clearly could have won. Keith Appling was not himself. I believe he had a wrist injury at that point, which hurt Michigan State. But, boy, that's when you think about all the talent on that team. And I didn't even mention in the discussion that Travis Trice was on that team as well. I mean, this was a loaded Michigan State basketball team that I think was very capable of winning the whole thing. They just ran into a buzzsaw in the Elite Eight, an ultra hot team that had just found itself. And, we always say when we talk about college basketball in particular, it's a guard game. Yeah. And UConn had guards that were playing at the top level of their potential. And conversely, Michigan State had its point guard not anywhere near 100%. And it ended up biting them.
Do you remember when Keith got hurt? Because I feel like they were cruising along and then he got hurt, and he was never the same that season. He was always looked like he was struggling.
I'm sure some of our listeners
people yelling
would
into
remember
their phone or whatever.
And I do remember this. He was another guy, just like Denzel we mentioned, who had a Champions Classic game against Kansas to open the season where he just took over. And it looked like, okay, because Keith had a good career, but kind of an up and down career. You might remember his sophomore year.
Yep.
He had a weird shooting slump where by the time they got to the tournament, teams were basically daring him to shoot, which was hard to believe if you'd seen him play in high school. He got past that. There always seemed to be one thing or another that was limiting him from being the top level player that I think he always had the potential to be. But as a senior, it looked like he was ready to do that. And then the wrist injury hit. And I don't recall, I don't think it was tremendously long before that game. Might have even happened in the tournament for all I can recall. But I do know that he was not 100% when they played UConn.
Yeah. And I felt like as soon as that injury happened, he just wasn't the same. And it limited that the team could be, which obviously happens when you're starting point guard.
Yeah, you say that, but they beat a Virginia team that was considered a favorite to win the whole deal. I mean, they were still really good, even with that. And frankly, even with that situation, should have beat.
Well, and I'm sure at some point we'll talk about Kalen Lucas, where he blows it ACL or Achilles in the tournament, where that was a team, That team,
we'll get to that.
Certainly
We'll
had a
get
better
to
chance,
that.
but that injury affected that team significantly. Before we go on to the number 8 team, just a reminder that if you have gutters in your house, well, if you have a house, you for sure in Michigan, you have gutters. So make sure they're operating properly. Make sure they're keeping the water away from your house. We've had some serious storms, and maybe you have a bunch of junk sitting in your gutter, and you really don't want to get on a ladder and clean it out. They will come by and clean it out. They'll maybe even put leaf guards on top if you ask them to. They'll also repair them. They can replace them, whatever you need done. Any job, big or small, the Brothers Just Two Gutters are the best. They take care of things. Everybody who's written into us says they're great. I had great experience with them and Curtis' team and Gregan's team out on the east side of the state. They'll take real good care of you. So make sure you head on over to the Brothers Just Two Gutters. You can find the ways to get their get an estimate from them at our support page at thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/support. You can get 10% off if you mention Final Four when you get your estimate. All right, so moving on to the number 8 team, the 2004-2005 Spartans, who were I'm trying to remember who they were. Who were they led by? Who was that? Was that a?
Well, it was a group of guys who had been around for a long time.
Oh yeah.
Paul Davis, Maurice Ager, Shannon Brown, but I think probably the best player on that team that year was Alan Anderson.
Right. Yep.
He had really come into his own where they'd finally settled on a position for him because he'd played some wing. He'd played some point guard for a while when they were hurting at that position. He eventually settled in that senior season as an undersized 4. And again, another example, it's funny to me this way that Izzo gets painted as being this stubborn traditionalist who won't keep up with the times, but all the things that people talk about as characteristics of modern basketball, I mean all of them. Undersized 4s who can stretch the floor, big men who can shoot, who you can use and pick and pop to force a defense to extend, positionless basketball where you have the actual fulcrum of your offense not necessarily be the point guard. Those are all things that Izzo's done and was doing them early before most people. Well, Alan Anderson, as a 4-man 20 years ago at 6'6", was an example of this. Yeah. But it was, again, a very deep team, an extremely talented team. It was a team filled with guys who had been very, very highly rated recruits. So I'm sure some of our listeners remember, but, Paul Davis, Kelvin Torbert, and Shannon Brown were all top 5 guys nationally by somebody in their classes. And then you had guys like Mo Ager and Alan Anderson, who were solidly top 50 guys. And then on top of that, you had Drew Neitzel. And really that team took off when Drew Neitzel, who was a freshman, was inserted in the starting lineup. Now, he was not yet the Drew Neitzel most of us remember from when he was a junior and a senior and he was scoring a lot. His role on this team was basically to just run the show offensively because they had been using Chris Hill. Mm-hmm. And Chris Hill was a great shooter, but he wasn't really a natural point guard. And that was the thing that really hurt this group as they moved along through their careers is, they had Marcus Taylor, who then left after his sophomore year. And then the next 2 years were really spent trying to find a point guard. As I mentioned, Alan Anderson got shoehorned into it for a while. Chris Hill was doing it. They had a guy, Rashi Johnson, who was a JUCO transfer, never quite panned out. Brandon Cott was a McDonald's All-American who didn't even make it out of the first semester, I don't believe, at Michigan State. So it was a problem with this particular era that was difficult to solve until Drew Neitzel showed up in 2004. And again, he didn't put up eye-popping numbers, but it was just they had somebody who could steady the ship and get them into their offense and let these other extremely talented players, and they had a ton of them, go to work. The other thing that helped is they added Matt Trannon from the football team as a walk-on who gave them that one extra physical body inside them. Matt was only about 6'6", but he was
a tank.
A tank, and he was a guy who had been as high as a top 10 player nationally in basketball at a younger age. He decided to focus on football once he got to college. but that ended up walking onto the team. And he really made a difference as a key reserve for this group because they really only had Paul Davis and Allen Anderson as big men. And again, Allen Anderson wasn't that big a player. So to have another guy who you could turn to and at least give you some spot minutes, and he was a very good rebounder, defender. That was key. So this was a loaded team. They had the misfortune of being really, really good in a year where Illinois had, I think, their best team in history.
Yeah.
And so that meant Michigan State didn't win the Big Ten regular season title. They didn't win the Big Ten tournament. And because the Big Ten as a whole was down that year, it was really only a 3-team league. Wisconsin was very good, and then Michigan State, and then Illinois. Those were the 3 teams. And then after that, you had a huge gap between that and the rest of the league. So consequently, Michigan State did not get a very good seed. I believe that team was a 5 seed, if memory serves. They were either a 4 or 5, and I think they were a 5. And it is remarkable when you look back at it that a team that was that loaded and had played as well as they had, because they'd had a great season. It was remarkable they were seeded as low as they were. But if you think back, they had what you could argue were the 2 most impressive, at least on paper, back-to-back NCAA tournament wins a Michigan State team has ever had. They beat Duke in the Sweet 16, and that's a game where Mo Ager famously teabagged J.J. Redick on a dunk. And then after that, they beat Kentucky in, what was it, a double overtime?
Yep.
In the Elite Eight. Yeah. So to beat Duke and Kentucky back-to-back when both were really good, I mean, those were not down years for those 2 programs. They were both considered title contenders that year. That's about as good as it gets. And then Michigan State had the misfortune on 2 levels. One, in the Final Four, they ran into North Carolina. So you're facing a very, very good North Carolina team. And then on top of that, Allen Anderson gets hurt in that game. People don't remember. I believe Michigan State was up at the half. It was tight, but I believe they were up. And in the second half, Carolina pulled away. Allen Anderson wasn't anywhere close to 100%, and that was enough to make up the difference. But, you know, you could argue for this team to be higher on this list. You could argue, I mean, truthfully, when you get into these, all the teams on my list, at least, I feel like you really are splitting hairs.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So you could argue for this team to be higher. I would say, given what I saw that season, if they'd beaten Carolina, which I think was possible if they'd been fully healthy, I don't feel like they would have beaten that Illinois team. That Illinois team just seemed to have their number. And it's funny saying that because Carolina beat that Illinois team. So you say, well, you could beat the team that beat them, but it's matchup.
Yeah, right.
And I just felt like that Illinois team with that 3, Michigan State's guards were incredible. You look at that perimeter group when Kelvin Torbert and Chris Hill are reserves, that says something. But Illinois with Deron Williams and Luther Head and D. Brown, that was an all-time great threesome in their backcourt. And I don't know that I think that Michigan State team could have gotten past Illinois in the title game anyway. But it was a great team. There's no 2 ways about that.
Well, we're going to hop into our Wayback Machine and head back into the 70s and go 1977-78 season for the number 7.
Yeah, and honest to God,
who was on that team, by the way? Is there anyone anyone famous?
Well, we'll get into that. We'll get into that in a minute. But there is, as I was putting this together, and I keep saying there are good arguments to have these teams in different orders if you wanted to make them. There's an argument this team, in my opinion at least, that this team is the best of any of them that didn't win a title. Now, this is where we get off Graham's list because this is the Judd Heathcote era. Right. It's actually the first Michigan State team I have vivid memories of was this team. So you had Irvin Johnson and Jay Vincent and Mike Berkovich as freshmen on that team. You had Greg Kelser as a junior who had been really good his first 2 years at Michigan State because the team wasn't great, didn't get a lot of recognition. Well, now he was getting a lot of recognition. They had a senior Bob Chapman, who had been a very good player at Michigan State up to that point, kind of had to take a bit of a back seat when Magic arrived. He was still a starter, but it wasn't the same role he had been in. You had veterans like Terry Donnelly and Ron Charles, who were still part of the team. So it was a team that I think there were expectations around, but coming into the season, but I think most of those expectations were localized. And it's because the state of media is so different than it is now. I don't think people truly knew what was coming until Magic arrived. And he just, and again, the Big Ten in this period was absolutely loaded. I mean, you had guys up and down this conference that were first-round draft pick NBA level players. And Michigan State, frankly, whipped everybody's ass. They won the Big Ten decisively. Actually, more decisively. You could make a good argument they were better in the regular season, certainly in conference play, than they were the next year when they won the national title.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because that year they had to share it with Purdue and Iowa. In 77-78, they won it outright. And they went into the tournament. If memory serves, they beat Western Kentucky and they beat Providence. And then they were in the Mideast Regional Final against the number one team in the country, the Kentucky Wildcats. And Kentucky was an incredibly experienced team. They were just loaded with veterans. But, Michigan State had Magic. So they had a shot. They end up losing that game 52-49 for two reasons. One, Magic had maybe his worst game of the season. It was very uncharacteristic. Secondly, Kentucky had a guy named Kyle Macy, who was like a 6'2" shooting guard, who had arguably the game of his life. And that was enough to bail them out and allow them to beat Michigan State. But that was a team that had they gotten past Kentucky, Kentucky did win the national title that year. And had Michigan State gotten past Kentucky, and they were right there. If you'd had even an average game from Magic, Michigan State wins. I think Michigan State probably would have won it. You could make an argument that Duke was in the title game that year against Kentucky. I think Michigan State was better than Duke and probably would have won the whole thing. But again, you could make a good argument this team should be the top of this list. I've got them where I have them seventh.
Yeah.
But yeah, you could, I could easily talk myself into bumping that higher because that was a dominant team right up until the point that they lost to Kentucky in a tight one. The eventual national champions, you lose by 3. And your best player didn't play well that day. So yeah, they were something else, that team.
Yeah, I was just looking it up, and actually that's the last time that Iowa won the Big Ten. Which is back.
Oh, no, I know. In 79. Yeah. That's what.
I mean, I didn't think I remember them winning since, but wow, that's a long time.
Nope. It's something. And that was a great Iowa team. I mean, Ronnie Lester was the point guard on that team. You're talking about 79, a year after this. That was a really, really good Iowa basketball team. Make no mistake about that. And they've had other good teams since then. But yeah, they haven't even really come close.
No.
To winning a Big Ten title. It's another reminder to people, as if they should need more of them. Understand what you've been witness to.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Because it's not that way most other places.
Yeah. Well, one of the great things we have with Michigan State is we have some great people who take care of us, like Nudge Printing. If you need Spartan apparel, there's no better place to go than Nudge Printing. You go to nudgeprinting.com. Very excited. My daughter is transferring to Michigan State in the fall, so we actually need to get her some Michigan State stuff. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of shopping there. They are everyone's most favorite T-shirts and sweatshirts, hoodies. So I'm going to have to get a pile of stuff from Gabe and his crew over there. They're all Michigan made, and they have all the different cool vintages. If you want vintage stuff for Michigan State or current stuff, they've got everything there. Good pricing, free shipping with orders over, I think, $50 or something like that. So you can't go wrong with Nudge Printing. They printed our shirts, and they do a great job. And again, even if you want other stuff, other teams in the state of Michigan outside of the Wolverines, you can head on over to Nudge Printing and get those taken care of. They also do sell Indiana, which is a knock since my son's going to Purdue. That's kind of a knock against Gabe. So maybe he'll come around and get some Purdue stuff. All right, moving on to the number 6 seed is the 19 and 20 team. And how did their tournament go, Rod?
Yeah, right. Well, that's the thing. They're the great unknown of this group because they're the only one that didn't have the disappointing end, right? Well,
right. Yeah, I know what you mean. Right.
They had an extremely disappointing end, but not in the way that all the rest of these teams had. They didn't get the chance due to COVID to play. And it's another team like the 13-14 team and like the 15-16 team that had some moments in the regular season where you wondered, where are they going to be? But by the end of the Big Ten tournament, or I guess that year was the end of the regular season.
The tournament never happened. I was in Indianapolis. I remember vividly turning around.
You felt like there wasn't anybody better.
Right.
They had to rally and go on a hell of a run, do things like beat co-champion Maryland at Maryland. They basically had to run the table late in the season to have any chance. I remember on this podcast at a certain point, fairly late in the season, saying, well, they're done in terms of hopes at a Big Ten title. It's really about now just making sure that you're at your best for the tournament.
Yep, I remember you saying that too.
And I was saying that, I was saying that because of where they sat in the standings and games that they had left to play. And yet they went ahead and did it. And again, the level that they were playing at by the end of the season, you really felt like, or at least I felt like, yeah, this team has as good a chance as anybody in the country. And if you remember, they were a very popular pick by people to win the title by the end of the regular season because people had seen, it was obviously a group, most of whom had been part of the Final Four team a year prior. And that gave, I think that plus the way that Cassius and Xavier Tillman were playing at the end of the season really tended to give you a lot of confidence that they were going to go on a run. We'll never know whether they would have followed through on that. They would, even if they had, they would have ended up on this list probably somewhere. Cassius, obviously, you want to talk about a year that had just seemed like 3. We know the way it ended, but remember in the beginning, you had the horrible tragedy of what happened to Cassius Winston's brother and what that did to him, what that did to that team, because they all knew his brother.
Yeah, they're close to him. He's part of the family.
That family had been, he and his brothers were, all 3 of them were constants on Michigan State's campus in the off season. So they all knew him very well. So it affected the whole team. And, we've had Coach Mike Garland on our show and talked about this, what kind of impact it had on Cassius, what kind of impact it had on the team. And so again, for that group to go through that, to then go through what was understandably inconsistent play for a while, and yet find that reserve of willpower to go out there and get it done when the chips were down, it was extremely impressive. And I know this. In March of 2020, I would not have wanted to bet against Cassius Winston. I know that much.
Yeah. Well, especially after the previous year, which is the number 5 team, is the 18-19 season, which was the last year for Xavier Tillman, and the combination that really started clicking by about midway through that season. And then, of course, the shot everyone will remember with Kenny Goins and to hit the 3 against Duke to win the final, to get to the Final Four.
Isn't it really funny that's a year that I think if you ask people, what do you remember about it? Nobody remembers very much about the loss to Texas Tech. because that win over not just Duke, but that
it was
Duke
with Zion Williamson too.
With Zion Williamson, and just how incredibly hyped that team had been all year long. And Michigan State was a team, again, coming off that loaded group in 17-18 we mentioned in the honorable mentions, lost a lot of guys. And then when they get into the season, you lose, I think it was some point in December, you lose Josh Langford to a season-ending injury, who up to that point had arguably been Michigan State's best player.
Oh, easily. He was easily really the best player, yeah.
And then Nick Ward goes down in January. And yet, at every turn, when these things are happening, this team gets off the mat and somehow doesn't even just survive it. They get better.
Yeah, right.
And by the end, Nick Ward is in a reserve role. Langford's not playing. And yet, this team wins the Big Ten, wins the Big Ten tournament by beating Michigan for the third time that year, and then goes into the NCAA tournament, wins the first 3 games all relatively easily. I mean, they had a little bit of a hiccup at times against Bradley, but then they just steamrolled Minnesota and LSU. Those weren't even really super competitive games.
Yeah.
And then they beat Duke on that Kenny Goins shot, as you say, in what was a true heavyweight fight. Both teams, that was not a game where either team really lost. That was a game Michigan State won because Duke made a lot of big plays too. And then it just kind of, you get to the Final Four, and Texas Tech was very well coached that year. That team was dialed into what Chris Beard wanted them to do. They were icing ball screens, and defensively they had that no middles principle where they were really forcing play to the sidelines. And they made it hard on MSU. You had some foul trouble with Aaron Henry in that game, which cost them. And so they lose. But that was a team, when you look at it, Virginia ends up beating Texas Tech in the next game to win the national title. But was that Michigan State team capable of winning it all? Yeah, I think sure. So. They just didn't have a great day against Texas Tech. And you could make an argument, there's no way of ever knowing this, that maybe the Duke game had been where all the chips were down and they might have just lost a little bit of their edge. So by the time they got to Texas Tech, you'd love to believe that's not the case, but and that you could never prove it anyway. But I think it's fair to speculate that might have been just that little extra that they had to get past Duke. They didn't have again left in the tank when they got to Texas Tech in the Final Four.
Yeah, which is why you thought, especially in 1920, that was sort of like almost a redemption year. That was the year they're going to go finish what they sort of left unfinished the previous year.
Absolutely.
So before we move on, we just want to remind you to check out another great sponsor of the show, the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. If you have dirty windows, and come on, honestly, who's cleaning their windows that often? You want to contact the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. They can take care of it. They can also power wash your house. So if your house is actually white but it looks brown, contact them. They will come out and they'll give you a great estimate. They'll take good care of you. 15% off if you mention Final Four when you get your estimate. You can find all that at the finalfoursontheschedule.com/support. They do meticulous work, really good pricing. I highly recommend them if you're in the Grand Rapids area. The Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids will clean your glass and clean your house. All right, so the number 4 seed is 2009-2010.
You mentioned the Kalen Lucas Achilles injury.
Right.
but we got to set the scene with this team earlier than that. So they're coming off, and we'll get back to this team in a few minutes as well. They're coming off an appearance in the national title game.
Right.
And they bring the vast majority of the team back. If I think about it, they'd lost Goran Suton and Travis Walt. But they'd added Derek Nix and Garrett Sherman. And then everybody else in a deep team was back. And that team they were good, but there were moments during that regular season where it didn't necessarily feel like they had maintained the edge or grown from the year prior. And it's kind of hard to understand why that was the case. But for most of that season, you could make a pretty good argument that it was Ohio State that was the best team in the conference. That was a year that Ohio State had Evan Turner just rolling.
Yeah.
And Michigan State rallied, ended up sharing the conference title with them. So it certainly wasn't like MSU had a bad regular season, but it just wasn't quite, I think, what expectations coming in were, okay, this is going to be like the 99-2000 team where they came close the year before, almost everybody back with a couple key additions. They're going to just steamroll people. And it wasn't like that. They were very good, but they weren't dominant. And then they get into the NCAA tournament, and they win their opener, and then they're in that second round game against Maryland. And they're humming. And then Kalen Lucas goes down with an injury.
Yeah.
And it ends up being a torn Achilles, which meant he, of course, missed the rest of the tournament. And, you know, he had a whole offseason of rehab in front of him. And Maryland, of course, seized on that momentum, kind of took control of the game a little bit, but Michigan State rallied. They end up getting a chance to win it. And, of course, they get that, what most of our listeners have probably watched 100 times, if they watched it once, that pass that Draymond Green makes in transition where Delvon Rowe has to duck out of the way to avoid it hitting him in the head. But he does, and it gets to Corey Lucius, and Corey Lucius takes a dribble or two to the top of the key, fires, hits a three. Michigan State wins it at the buzzer. So a huge, huge win. Then they end up in a tight Elite Eight game against Tennessee, which, as I remember, Raymar Morgan was just a monster down the stretch. And they put away Tennessee to get back to the Final Four. And now you're looking at a Final Four where Michigan State is facing Butler. And this was the Brad Stevens era where he ended up this season and the following season going to back-to-back Final Fours.
Yeah.
And Butler was really good. People didn't fully appreciate how much talent that team had. Gordon Hayward, who's had a long NBA career, was on that team. They had some other guys like Shelvin Mack, and I think the big man was a kid named Matt Howard, who had long pro careers overseas. And that was a very, very good Butler team. They weren't, they were Cinderella, but not as much. If you think about teams like George Mason in 06, maybe the VCU team under Shaka Smart, they weren't that.
No.
They had better talent than those teams had. Michigan State loses a very close game, but the reason I've got them here is, if you remember, Draymond Green had a chance to win it with a jumper.
Yep.
And he very clearly got fouled on the arm. I mean, there's the famous still shot. I believe it was Hayward that fouled him, where his hand is clearly on his forearm. And the shot, if I remember right, I believe the shot was an air ball. Yeah. It was short. Well, obviously, because there was contact.
Right.
Michigan State should have won that game. And if they had won that game, Duke ended up beating Butler in an extremely tight national title game. That was by far the worst Duke title team. I would even go so far as to say it was the least talented Final Four team Mike Krzyzewski ever had, probably by a considerable margin.
Yeah.
That was not a great Duke team. Michigan State, man for man, I believe, absolutely believe, had more talent than Duke. And you don't say that very often in that matchup.
No.
Where you say, well, there's a decided Michigan State. I believe there was, even with Kalen Lucas out. So there's two elements to this one. The first is, as it played out without Kalen Lucas, that Michigan State team easily could have won the national championship. If they had Kalen Lucas, even more so. Because they were playing without their best player in that run.
Yeah, right.
For a good percentage of that tournament run, they were without their best player. He was the reigning Big Ten Player of the Year. He didn't win it that season as a junior, but he had won it as a sophomore. He had quarterbacked his team to the national title game the year prior. And you're missing that guy, and yet you still get all the way to the Final Four. Should have won that game. And again, as I say, I think would have beaten Duke without Kalen. With him, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, going back and watching some clips of him, boy, he was so good. You sort of forget how good he was.
He was, the thing about Kalen is he was only a good shooter, not a great one, jump shooter. He wasn't a pure point guard. He was okay. He got better as he went along, but he wasn't a guy like, we talk about somebody like Jeremy Fears, who just has pure point guard instincts, or Mateen Cleaves. That was not Kalen Lucas. He had to learn that stuff. He had been a scorer primarily. He was a good defensive player. I wouldn't say he was ever a dominant one, but man, as a guy who was able to use his quickness to create scoring opportunities for himself and by proxy for teammates. I remember I used to say the two best things that could happen in Michigan State offensively in that era were Kalen Lucas going to the rim and scoring, or Kalen Lucas going to the rim and missing. Because he drew so much attention that there were easy second chance points available all the time when he would miss in traffic. Teams had to bring multiple guys over, and it would just open up easy putbacks. So, yeah, very disappointing that team wasn't able to get it done, because I think they were right there.
Yeah, and I think that was the era of the really bad shorts, too, if I recall. The ones that almost go down to your ankles, but maybe that was a year before.
It was that time period. Yeah. No, it was during that time period.
Looking back at those pictures, they don't seem like real possible pictures. Moving on to the number 3 seed, you have the 2000-2001 team, which is the team obviously that followed the national championship team after Mateen Cleaves leaves. And I think I know I was surprised that they made the Final Four that year, because it did not just because I felt like the era was sort of over with Mateen Cleaves, and to get back there was with almost like a different, sort of a different team, a different identity, was very impressive.
Yeah, different identity, but yes and no is two different teams. Because you got to remember, you had Charlie Bell and Andre Hudson, who were 4-year starters. So they'd been there for all of that. And those guys were still around. David Thomas had been there for all of that. He was still around as a guy in the rotation. Mike Chappelle had been there for a lot of it. He was in his 3rd year in the program at that point, because he'd redshirted a year and then played 2. So they had a lot of experience. But then you got to remember, that team then has Jason Richardson emerging after he'd been a freshman who was an important rotation guy, gave them an extra jolt of energy off the bench. But as a sophomore, he became the guy.
Yeah.
And he was about as good as anybody in the country that year. He was phenomenal. In every phase of the game, he improved. People said, well, he's an inconsistent defender. He became a lockdown defender. He said, well, he doesn't shoot threes well. He shot them extremely well that year. He'd always obviously had the incredible athleticism. So he took over. You had Al Anaganye, who was a real factor for that team. And then remember, you add in 2 of the top 5 freshmen in the country in Zach Randolph and Marcus Taylor.
Yeah.
And the controversy that season, for the most part, was, when are these guys going to start? And it didn't end up happening for Marcus. It did end up happening for Zach eventually. But he had to earn his way into that spot. Al Anaganye was a really good player. And he played the game the way Izzo wanted it played. And Zach had to learn some things, especially defensively, before he was going to get that role. But, again, you look at NBA talent. So Zach Randolph and Jason Richardson, I'm trying to think. Draymond Green has had the best NBA career of any Izzo player. But you can make a pretty good argument that Jason Richardson and Zach Randolph are number 2 and number 3.
Yeah, Gary Harris is somewhere in there too, and Jaren Jackson, I suppose.
He's not at their level.
Yeah.
He's not at their level. Jaren Jackson may be able to make an argument when it's all said and done, maybe. But for right now, those guys are 2 and 3, I think, pretty clearly. And they were both on that team. Charlie Bell had a long NBA career. Then you go with guys like Andre Hudson, who had a very successful long-term pro career in Europe. Again, David Thomas, I believe, played in Australia. Mike Chappelle. It was it was a team that really had a bit of everything. It had a ton of experience because, especially Hudson and Bell, there wasn't anybody in the country that had played in more big games than those guys had by that point. There wasn't anybody close.
Yeah.
So you had that. You had young talent starting to assert itself, especially Richardson. And then you had fantastically talented newcomers, freshmen. So they really had a bit of everything with that group. And they were, again, one of those rare Izzo teams that was a monster right out of the gate. They didn't lose until a few games into Big Ten play. I think their first loss, if I remember correctly, came on a Kirk Hastings shot at the buzzer in Bloomington where they lost to Indiana on the road. But they had just been winning since the start of the season. So unusual for an Izzo team in that respect. They win the Big Ten. I think they won the Big Ten tournament, although I'm not sure about that. And then they get to a Final Four. Unfortunately, that was one of the most talented Final Fours I can think of in the last 25 years. Michigan State faced an Arizona team that had Gilbert Arenas, Richard Jefferson. I mean, had a bunch of pros themselves. And Michigan State, that was another game, kind of like the Carolina game a few years later, where if I remember correctly, Michigan State led in a tight one at the half, and then the second half was just a blowout.
Yeah.
It was hard to believe. I remember being shocked watching it because it just, at that point, you had Michigan State on this multi-year run where if it's a big game, okay, maybe they could lose it like the 99 team did in the Final Four to Duke, but it's going to be close. Nobody's going to blow them off the floor. It was just shocking to see. And then, Duke ends up winning the national title that year, and that was a team, Shane Battier and, Jason Williams. There was a lot of talent on that team too. But in terms of just talent, and then on top of that, winning pedigree, experience, all of that stuff, that Michigan State team might be as good as any, and I'm including the 2000 team. In pure talent, it's hard to argue. I think the biggest difference, if you're looking for the reason why one won the title and the other did, is an obvious one. Most people would come to it pretty quickly, but just because it's obvious doesn't make it untrue. That team in 01 did not have a Mateen Cleaves. And I don't just mean the leadership. That too. But, they had Charlie Bell playing at point guard, which he learned to play decently well. But he wasn't ever the natural that Mateen was. And Marcus Taylor was a freshman. And then for as talented as he was, I would argue he was not that kind of player either. Mm-hmm. He was another one of those guys that was more of a scorer in a point guard's body. Yes, he could. Yeah. I mean, he led the Big Ten in assists as a sophomore, so it's not like he didn't know how to pass, but he wasn't that kind of catalyst that Cleaves was. So I think that was the biggest difference. Otherwise, I think the 01 team might have had more horsepower.
All right. Well, then, before we get to the final two segments, I just want to briefly mention that if you need, it's great to do things on your own, and I like to do things on my own, although I found out this weekend, I don't know what you're like, Rod, but if I get within 10 feet of poison ivy, it seems to get me. And so I decided to do some trimming with my weed whacker. And anyway, so I got...
Oh, boy.
I should always remember, I got to shower right as soon as I do that so I don't get that oil all over my legs. So anyway, I've got the wonderful poison ivy again, as I always seem to have at the beginning of the year as I try and clear some brush out. So don't do things yourself that other experts can do. And the point is, the Christian Brothers Automotive, they are the experts to take care of your car. They're the honest mechanics that you want. When you go to a new town, you need a good auto mechanic, you need a good, good lawyer, a good doctor, right? And a good accountant. And so if you're in the Grand Rapids area, the Christian Brother Automotive is a great place to go. Even if you're buying a new car, they can check it out, make sure that it's okay. So before you end up buying a lemon or something off a lot, make sure you have them doing a quick inspection. It's like $100, but it's totally worth it because if you have problems that you can't see, they can cost you lots of money later on. So they have a special right now for oil changes. Normally it's a $99.99. It's $59.99, so $40 off if you mention Hoops when you go in and get your car worked on. They'll give you not only the oil change, they rotate your tires for free, and then also do a courtesy inspection. So head on over to Christian Brothers Automotive. You can find information of that on our support page at thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/support. All right, so moving on to the number 2 seed is the 98-99 team. So we're kind of sticking right around the national championship team. So as a team, that was the year right before the national championship. So obviously Mateen Cleaves is on that team.
Yeah, and so was Antonio Smith,
right.
which were and Jason Klein, which were the guys who were missing from the next year. This was a really, really good team. To refresh people's memories, that was a year where the Big Ten had gone to a 16-game conference schedule. And so Michigan State was coming off a Sweet 16 and a share of a Big Ten title. But so expectations were really high, of course. But, you still have to follow through on that success. And so just because expectations were high, it's like, well, you got to prove it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And boy, did they ever. They lost their Big Ten opener, and I believe it was at Breslin. They lost to Wisconsin, Dick Bennett's Wisconsin team, and then they ripped off 15 in a row. And then they followed that up the year prior. They had gone into the first ever Big Ten tournament as the 1 seed and lost their first game against Minnesota. I know because I was there at the United Center. It wasn't fun. Year 2, so again, they've got that monkey to get off their back. They just roll through it. They win the Big Ten tournament. And then in the NCAA tournament, they're rolling, and they get to that Elite 8 game, and they're facing Kentucky. And they got off to a terrible start. Kentucky was out to a double-digit lead early, and I remember seeing it on camera, but I remember the stories about essentially Antonio Smith going after everybody in the huddle and basically threatening their lives if they didn't find it within themselves to play harder and play better. And Michigan State ends up rallying. They win that game. They're back to their first Final Four since 1979. First one in 20 years. So they had made good on their potential, right? But now you're there. Can you win it? And they're facing Duke. And it was, again, a dynamite Duke team. You had a freshman, Shane Battier. You had guys like Corey Maggette. It was a William Avery. It was a typically loaded Duke team. And they were the favorites to win the whole deal. Elton Brand actually was the star of that team. And Michigan State played really, really well. Played competitively. They were in it. They just came up a little short. And then Duke goes into the national title game and gets upset by UConn, led by Rip Hamilton and Khalid El-Amin, among others. Would that Michigan State team have been able to beat that UConn team? I don't know. That UConn team was very much on a mission, and they were really good too. And I don't feel like Michigan State played poorly in the semifinal loss to Duke. I think they played reasonably well, but they just didn't have quite enough. I think they had to go through that as the last step of the learning process with that group.
Yeah.
They'd been on a 3-year development mission, and then once they learned that lesson, just how good you have to be to win when you get to that stage, the next year in 2000, they were ready for it. And we saw that actually in action, not so much in the Final Four, but in earlier games against Syracuse in the Sweet 16 and against Iowa State in the Elite 8, where in both games they trailed.
Yeah.
And fairly late, and they had to really find it within themselves. I think those were the lessons they learned that year prior and lost to Duke. But honestly, that Michigan State team in 99 was fantastic. And that's why I've got them as high as I do. When you go through a league like the Big Ten, 15-1, and then you count the tournament, 18-1,
yeah,
you're really good. You are a really good team. And there was another bit to show you how good the league was. Ohio State was also in the Final Four that year.
Right.
And if Purdue was very good that year, I mean, there were some good basketball teams in the Big Ten. And to run through it the way they did, really, really impressive. So that's why I have them rated as highly as I do.
And then we come to the last, and the team that was, I suppose, I don't know what, the best team to have missed win the national championship. And you have the 2008-2009 team, which ended up playing in Detroit, where they the whole economic downturn hit Michigan harder as recessions always do with the automotive industry. And it sort of became, and with it being in Detroit, became a big deal for Michigan State to reach the Final Four, and then of course the national championship game.
Yeah, and again, this was a team that was coming off a Sweet 16 the year prior, and they had a ton of talent. They had a nice mix of experience and some very good young players, and so expectations were high, but they had to make good on it. So if you remember, that team played North Carolina in the non-conference at Ford Field and got blown out. Mm-hmm. And that was supposed to be let's get used to the surroundings because we're going to be back here in March, right?
Yeah.
Well, there were no assurances of that, but they had to go through it and win their way there. And that they did. They win the Big Ten, roll into the tournament, and that was a really impressive 3-game run that they had, if you remember, leading into the national title game. They beat Kansas in the Sweet 16. That was a rare Kansas team that wasn't seeded that highly. They had kind of Bill Self's tenure. That was one of his lesser achieving regular season teams. They weren't bad, but they weren't a 1 or a 2 seed.
Yeah.
But they pushed Michigan State. That's one, if you remember, you've probably seen the highlights. There's a late game mid-range jumper that Kalen Lucas hits and draws a foul, and he celebrates he's almost crab walking with a slapping 5 with Darrell Summers. It was a big shot and a big moment. And they take out Kansas in the Sweet 16. And then they get to the Elite 8. And it's really hilarious to think about this now. But if you remember, and it's easy for us in retrospect to see it this way, but I remember thinking at the time, North Carolina was so obviously the best team in the country that year, but they were not the number 1 overall seed. The number 1 overall seed in that tournament was Louisville. And Louisville had gotten a ton of hype because of the way they'd run through a supposedly very good Big East. And so Michigan State gets to that regional final, and it's essentially a fait accompli that Louisville's supposed to win this game. Well, nobody told Goran Suton because Goran Suton absolutely shredded their zone, got himself into the gap at the free throw line extended, and just punished them relentlessly. And it, in fact, played so well, he ended up winning most outstanding player of the regional. He had played well in the other games, but it was that game that won him that award, I assure you. And Michigan State won that game easily. Like, it wasn't even that tight.
Yeah, I think Louisville shot like 20% of the second half. I mean, their defense was unbelievable in that second half. I think that was the game.
Yeah. And so it was clear by that point that this team had really fun. They've had some ups and downs at some points in the regular season, but it mostly been very good. But it was clear they were finding another level. And so then you get to the Final Four, and they're facing another Big East team, UConn, who everybody is raving about. And again, Michigan State handles them. That's the game where Darrell Summers dunked on Stanley Robinson, maybe the best live game dunk I've ever seen, in a Michigan State game at least. Just a huge momentum play. Michigan State handles them. And so now you're in the national title game against, as I said, what I believed all along was the best team in the country, North Carolina. And for the second time in that building that year, North Carolina went out in the title game and just handled Michigan State. I can see arguing it. When you're looking at a question like this, it really depends what your criteria is, what you're evaluating. Is the question, which team had the best chance to win it and didn't, or which team was the best and didn't.
Yeah.
Because they're two different things. This particular team did not have the best chance. A year later, that team had a much better chance because there was nobody close to Carolina's level in that Final Four. I would argue that several of the teams on this list had better chances in terms of who the potential opponents were or the actual opponents that they faced than this team did. Because I think this team could have played that North Carolina team 10 times. Maybe they get lucky once.
Yeah.
But that's it.
That was a super team.
That North Carolina team they were deep, they were incredibly experienced, and they just understood how to play well together. And so it was obvious that they were the best team. I think they made it very, very obvious all year long. But just because this Michigan State team didn't have the best chance, the way I look at it is what was the best team. And I do think this was the best team that never won a title at MSU, because by the time they got to that stage, they were phenomenal. And I'm telling you, probably 9 years out of 10, 8 years out of 10, they win it.
Yeah.
They just had the misfortune of being great in a year where there was a team even greater still. And that doesn't happen very much to teams as good as that Michigan State team was. So that was the criteria I used. You could choose to look at the question differently and come to a different conclusion. But that's why I landed where I did.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think I like the list, and I think it was really good. Yeah, I was just looking, as I'm following along with you, I don't understand how you have this encyclopedic memory of all these games, but you have to use Wikipedia. And it is remarkable. And I know we say this all the time, and it maybe gets kind of old and stale, but I mean, 26 straight years that Michigan State's been in the tournament. Since 1979, they've only missed a tournament in 11 years, and that's not largely been Izzo's years. I mean, I guess the very beginning of his career.
Well, nine of them would be Judds.
Yeah, 9 of them are Judds. But since 98, so Michigan State's been in the tournament since 98, and of course the year that COVID said didn't happen, but they would have been in anyway. Anyway, only losing the first round 6 times out of 26, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's truly amazing to see the run, and I feel bad because part of that I missed because I was in med school and in residency, so I didn't get to appreciate the first 6 years or so. I mean, I saw the national title game, but I really didn't see any games outside that because, again, to those of you who are younger, not every game was televised back in 2000 or 2002, especially if you're not in Michigan, right? It was harder to watching the games and such. I wouldn't even know they were going on because that's just hard to imagine times like that.
Even NCAA tournament games.
Oh, yeah.
Because, if you remember,
they'll switch away.
It would be, there would only be the game that was on in your market.
Right.
And yes, they would whip around for competitive finishes and all that. But yeah, if you were living out of market, there wasn't any kind of guarantee you were going to get to see Michigan State.
Yeah. Or oftentimes I'd see the first half and that's all I'd see. And then
my years, so I was in San Francisco from 91 to 94. And in 2 of those 3 years, Michigan State played in the tournament. I believe they played 2 games each of those 2 years they made it, and I saw 1 of the 4 total.
Yeah, because I don't think you can even go to bars and see it. I think it's just whatever.
No.
Yeah.
No, there wasn't any kind of package like that available.
No.
I saw them beat Seton Hall, but I didn't see them lose to Grant Hill and Duke live.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 92 season, I didn't see either of their games. So, yeah, it was very definitely a different era.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember listening to games on the radio. I remember listening to football games on the radio, too. And because there was no other, unless you watch the replay on Channel 23, WKR.
Listen, there were Big Ten games.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
In the Magic era. I had, and in the Skiles era, as late as that I had to listen to on the radio. Absolutely.
All right. Now we're just really aging ourselves as, I'm sitting here with my poison ivy.
Yeah.
I'm, no matter how old I get, I still am just dumb and still get into that stuff. So be careful this spring. Make sure you have your steroids cream. Check out our sponsors. Go to the sponsor page at thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/support. For the Nudge Printing, the Squeegee Squad at Grand Rapids, Christian Brothers Automotive at Grand Rapids, and the Brothers Adjust You Gutters. the best in all those services. So I guess until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.